All right. So let's get on with week number 9. So week number 9 shifts us into the story of Joseph. You'll remember at the end of week 8, we had a genealogy. And in Genesis, whenever we hit a genealogy, where the author of Genesis is kind of shifting us into a new story. And so the new story in Genesis chapter 37 is a focus on Joseph. Jacob is still part of the story, but really the focus is on Joseph. And a couple of things that kind of stood out to me as I was reading Genesis chapter 37. I wanted to read verses 5 through 11 for you because they were so, excuse me, they were really so pivotal to the beginning of this particular story. So in Genesis chapter 37, verse 5, Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. There's a couple of things here. I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, have either personally experienced sibling rivalry, seen it in our children or our grandchildren, or seen it in other people's families. And what Joseph is doing here is not conducive to good family health, right? I mean, he's essentially telling. Now, remember, Joseph is this. No, he's not the second youngest, but he's certainly not the eldest of the family. So he's kind of down there in the last 3 quarters. And so for him to say he's going to reign over these other brothers, in addition to all the shatteredness of this family because of the arguments between Rachel and Leah and their maidservants and all these different brothers from different mothers, and just a very fractured family. And so Joseph, in the midst of this, is kind of telling them these dreams. And I really wonder what Joseph's personality was. Like, was he ignorant of, what this was going to do, or was this purposeful? Like, this is his way of kind of saying, you know, that I'm going to rule over you, and not knowing how that's all going to happen, right? Joseph has no idea how this is going to come to pass, but I wonder, given the dysfunction of this family, certainly Joseph is Jacob's favorite by a long shot. And I wonder if this wasn't him just kind of twisting the knife a little bit more with his brothers. I have a hard time believing he was utterly ignorant of the impact that his, sharing of the dreams was going to have. Another, we always talk about making sure that we pay attention to repetition. And something that kind of struck me, I don't think that there's I don't know that there's a purposeful connection here, but we do see in verse 11 that Jacob kept the matter in his mind. It kind of has this sound, at least to me, kind of familiar to Mary holding these things in her heart, right? Like she in Luke, the shepherds come and they tell about all these angels and everything that's happening, and they go to the temple and these people are praising God for Jesus, and it tells us that Mary kept these things in her heart. She pondered them in her heart, and it almost kind of sounds very similar to what Jacob is saying here. I don't know that there's a connection, although Luke's gospel doesn't rely very heavily on Genesis per se, so I don't know that there's a connection. But again, it's just one of those things where it sounds similar. It sounds like an echo, if you will, of what Luke will eventually write about. Well, as you know, Jacob sends Joseph out to his brothers. He's looking for them. They moved from here to there. He has to go and see them. And when they see him in the distance, in verse 20, I'm sorry, from verse 19, we see here comes that dreamer, right? So that those dreams are still really a burr in their saddle. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Right. So they are very unhappy with Joseph, to say the least. When remember, Reuben is the firstborn, so he is responsible for the family. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from his hands. He says, let's not take his life. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into a cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. And Reuben, it says here, was intending to kind of rescue him and take him back. But again, given the fracturedness of this family, you wonder what Reuben's intentions are. Like, because he's going to bring him back to his father. Like, is Reuben looking to get into Jacob's good graces because he, rescued his brother from from this cistern? What was Joseph going to say when he got back? Was he going to tell on all his brothers? I mean, there's just a lot of questions here because of the fracturedness. And so they do this. They take him. They take that robe, and that it's hard to translate. Multicolored robe, or not technicolor, but it has this idea of a robe that set Joseph apart from his brothers. Like, everybody knew that he kind of had Jacob's favor because of this robe. So his clothing was kind of setting him apart. They take the robe from him. They throw him into the cistern, and there's no water in it. It's an empty cistern, so he's not going to drown. And then look at verse 25. This just strikes me as to how calloused his brothers are. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. They have just taken their brother. They've beaten him up. They've essentially, taken all his clothes off of him, thrown him into a cistern, right? And then they sit down and eat, right? Like, they have such little guilt or such little conscience on this that they can eat a meal around the cistern, right? So they're sitting around, or at least near the cistern, eating this meal. Well, the Ishmaelites come, they see the Ishmaelites, and his brothers decide, well, if we kill them, we get nothing. But if we sell them to the Ishmaelites, we can make some money off of them. All right. So they get something out of it. Not only do they get rid of Joseph, they get some money out of it. And again, just shows the depth of kind of depravity that the brothers had. And so they sell him to the Midianites. Reuben comes back. He wasn't there when all this was going on, and he's upset that they've done this. So they take the robe, they slaughter a goat, and dip the robe in the blood, and they take that robe back to Jacob, and Jacob thinks that his son has been killed by an animal. And look at verse 35. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. So his father wept for him. That refusing to be comforted also comes up in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. And Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15 is a prophecy about the destruction of Judah. And in verse 15, it's a familiar passage to us from the Christmas story. A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, and look at this, and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Now, that refusing to be comforted in Jeremiah is talking about the future destruction of Judah by Babylon, right? And then Matthew takes that when Herod kills all the children in Bethlehem. And remember, Rachel was buried in Bethlehem. And again, he uses that passage, that refusing to be comforted. And so around Rachel and Jacob and Joseph is this lack of comfort that is happening. And what's interesting is that eventually Joseph goes into exile, right? He's taken to Egypt and goes into exile. And so just like in Jeremiah, Jeremiah says that Rachel is weeping for her children because they are no more, because they've been taken into exile. And so we see kind of this parallel between Joseph being taken to Egypt, Israel being taken to Babylon, and then we see that that Matthew is using this as a precursor to show that Jesus goes into Egypt, right? That's how he escapes the killing of Herod. And so he's showing that Jesus is kind of the culmination of everything that Israel was intended to be. But that refusing to be comforted seems to come up again and again. All right, so chapter 37. Any questions that anybody has? Again, you can click on the reactions button and use the raise hand feature. Or if you have the chat section up, which it should be either along the bottom or click on more and you'll see chat, and you can type a message into the chat, and I will see raised hands and chat if anybody has questions on chapter 37. All right. What I'm going to ask also, if you decide to type the chat in instead of raise your hand, just type in yes real quick, and then I'll know to wait for you to type, because I know some of us aren't very fast typers. There we go. Good. Is Tom, thank you. So Tom, you did a direct message to me. That's perfectly fine. But is Joseph a Christ type for us, or a foretelling of him? It appears that he was the scapegoat. Yeah, there are a lot of parallels between Joseph and Jesus. So yeah, I would say that he does certainly prefigure Christ in many ways. He parallels Christ in the sense of being rejected by his brothers, his family, being sent into exile, suffering in exile, and then eventually essentially becoming the ruler, right? So Jesus becoming the king, but he becomes the king through the rejection of his people, who and when you even think of Judas taking the money for Jesus, that idea that there's money that's exchanged on behalf of the one that suffers. So Tom, definitely there are a lot of parallels between Joseph and Christ. So good question. Any other questions that anybody has? All right. I see no hands and I see no chat. So we're going to move on. If you have questions, keep typing them in, or we can answer them as we go along. So we can always go back. So don't feel like we're past it. We can't go back. But and let's move on to Genesis 38. So Genesis 38 is a bit odd because we're right in the middle of this story. Joseph is sold to Potiphar at the end of chapter 37, and then all of a sudden in chapter 38 we get this story about Judah and Tamar. And it's a bit odd. Why is there this break in the story? We don't have a genealogy, so it's not shifting. The story's not shifting to Judah, and yet we have Joseph in Egypt, and chapter 39 is going to pick right up with Joseph in Egypt. So why Genesis chapter 38? Why this break in Joseph's story? I think there's a couple of different elements here. One that is obvious to the structure of Genesis, and one that is far less obvious to the original audience of Genesis. So, first and foremost, it shows the wickedness of his brothers. So, you know, who, if God is, so remember Genesis chapter 12, God is stepping in and saying, I'm going to fix everything that went wrong in Genesis chapter 3, right? So how's that going to happen? Like, who else in the family is good enough to kind of carry the covenant onward? And we find that there's a highlight of Judah here just to show how wicked his brothers were. Like, Judah is sleeping with women, right? Not just Tamar, but this seems to be a common practice for Judah, and is not willing to sustain the lineage of his sons. Now, to some degree, you can almost understand this, right? Judah has 3 sons, and the first son dies after marrying Tamar, and then the second son dies after marrying Tamar, and you don't want to play those odds, right? You don't want to give the third son and lose the third son, right? And so he kind of lies to her and says, "Oh, well, we'll we will wait until the third son is old enough." But really, he's not doing that at all. And so Tamar kind of uses him and really almost bypasses the generation, right? So Judah has a son now with his daughter-in-law, essentially Tamar. Now, that Levirate marriage was important in Judaism because, again, lineage is important. Why is lineage important? Lineage is important because it's part of the covenant. It's part of the promise that God is making to the Israelites. And so, if a man died without having any children, what's called a kinsman redeemer. We're going to hear about this later on. This comes up a couple of different times in Scripture, and in one place, in a very important place. But the kinsman redeemer would come in, and he's redeeming the family. So the brother would take the sister-in-law as and have children with her. Those children would remain part of the lineage of the original brother, if that makes sense. Okay. So the upside is genealogy happens. The downside is that the kinsman redeemer, the brother who has to take this sister-in-law, has to also give part of his estate to the sister-in-law and the new son, right? So that's where there's not a strong desire for people to be kinsmen redeemers, because instead of me splitting my inheritance with my 4 sons, now I have to split my inheritance with maybe another 2 or 3 sons, right? Now all of a sudden it all gets watered down a bit. And so we understand why Judah is doing this. But by the same token, it's not pleasing in God's eyes that this is happening. And so Tamar is deceitful to Judah, but deceitful in a way that shows Judah's own wickedness. And this is, I believe, put here because we get to see an example of just how bad the brothers are. Like, if we didn't know how bad they were when they took Joseph and sold him off into slavery, here we get to see just how bad they are. But notice that Judah is also open to conviction, right? When Tamar confronts him with what he has done, he recognizes that Tamar has done the right thing and he has not. And so there is a sense in which there is a repentance and a restoration that comes from Judah. And so I think that all of that is important in this part of the story, because we're going to shift to Joseph. Joseph is going to be kind of the rescuer of the people of God. But this relationship between Judah and Tamar is also really important to us, because when we get to Matthew chapter 1, we find out that it's through Tamar's son Perez that Jesus eventually is born. So Judah and Tamar and Perez are all part of the lineage of Jesus. And so it's helpful within the context of Genesis. And also when we get to the New Testament, we find it's incredibly helpful to the context of Jesus. Any questions on this particular chapter? There's a lot in this chapter that is not familiar to us. So does anybody have questions on this? I think we lost Bruce along the way, but I see Robert is still on, so I'm hoping that the Sky Valley people are still on. All right, I see no chat happening, and I see no hands being raised. So I am going to presume that we're good to move forward. All right, Genesis chapter 39. When we get to Genesis chapter 39, oh, good. Thank you, Robert. When we get to chapter 39, in verse 12, Joseph is working Potiphar's house. He's working so well that Potiphar puts him in charge of everything in the entire household. And then he gets these overtures from Potiphar's wife to sleep with her. And Joseph says, no, I can't do such a wicked thing. And interestingly, in verse 9, he says, and sin against God. So it would be a wicked thing against Potiphar, but he recognized that adultery would be a sin against God. And she keeps trying to have him go to bed with her, but he keeps refusing. And then verse 11 of chapter 39, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. So now Potiphar's wife has probably set this up, right? So she's kind of setting it up so that she's alone with him. And in verse 12, she caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. You notice how another coat gets Joseph in trouble, right? That multicolored coat that Jacob had given to Joseph made his brothers incredibly jealous of him. And now he has another cloak that's left behind, and this is going to get him in trouble with Potiphar. Now, Potiphar is a high-ranking official. Messing around with his wife is no small thing. Again, you hold some things loosely, right? I tend to think that Potiphar kind of knew what his wife was like, because normally for a high-ranking official like this, for a slave to try and mess around with the wife would be punishable by death. But Potiphar doesn't kill Joseph. He puts him in prison, right? So you can't. You have to send a message to the rest of the slaves, right? You don't want them, trying to mess around with his wife. But I tend to think that Potiphar kind of understands what his wife is like. So instead of killing Joseph, he sends him into prison, where he connects with the guard of the prison. And we find that the guard of the prison puts Joseph in charge of the whole prison, right? So we see that Joseph has moved from being the favored son to being the favored servant to being the favored prisoner, right? All along the way. I mean, clearly things are going downward, right? So he starts at, favored son, and then favored servant, and then favored prisoner. So things are going downward. We're not suggesting that things are, nice and sunny for Joseph. But at the same time, he is favored in each of these positions um, because of both his personality, his work ethic, but certainly because of God's blessing, right? God's blessing and protection on him. And God is watching over him in the midst of this, even though we don't read much of God in any of this, right? We're going to hear that later on, that Joseph is going to say it's by God's design that this all happened. So he sees God in the midst of it, but we don't hear very much about God. But God is giving him favor with the people around him, and I think that's important for us to draw from as believers as well. So who are the people in your life that God gives you favor with, right? So for me, and this goes back even to my early days of pastoral ministry, and even before that as an elder in the church, I often connected really well with the college students. And now at TFC, I connected to college students there. God gives me favor with college students. Like they're okay being around me, this old man, right? And I'm able to speak into their lives and give them guidance. So he's given me favor with those people. Who are the people that God has given you favor with? Who are the people that God has given you where they look favorably upon you? Because those are opportunities for us to be able to serve God, even if we're serving people in other ways. And we see that in Joseph here. Any questions on chapter 39? All right. I see no hands and I see no chatting. Let's move on to Genesis 40. And I'm going to give you all time at the end as well. If there are any questions that you're thinking about but haven't asked, just because we're in the Zoom feature here, I'll make sure that we have time at the end to answer any questions that anybody might have. When we get to Genesis chapter 40, we have the cupbearer and the baker. And these are two positions that we need to be aware of in ancient courts, where the baker is exactly what it sounds like. The baker is the one who bakes goods, perhaps cooks as well. I don't know that it's so specific to just baking, but it's certainly somebody who provides food to the king. And this had to be an incredibly trusted person, because it would be very easy to poison the king. So you were very concerned about who was making your food, right? So the baker is a very trusted person within the kingdom. The cupbearer is almost always the most trusted person. So the cupbearer is the person who not only brings the king his wine or his drink, he typically would eat the food before the king to make sure that it wasn't poisonous. Oftentimes, because the cupbearer was so trusted by the king, oftentimes the cupbearer could give guidance, and the king might ask for some guidance or some wisdom from the cupbearer. So these are two really important positions in the kingdom, and it's not just like you fill out a resume and get the job for baker for the king, right? I mean, this is somebody who has a background with the pharaoh to the extent that he trusts them so deeply to have these particular positions. So the cupbearer and the baker offended Pharaoh in some way, and he's angry with them, and he throws them in jail, right? And while they're in jail, they have these dreams, and these dreams really bother them because they don't know how to interpret them. And in verse 8, they say that just that, verse 8 of chapter 40, the cupbearer and the baker, they say, we both had dreams, but there's no one to interpret them. And then Jesus said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. You notice how Joseph is deflecting the ability to understand dreams to God. So it's not that he has some special ability to interpret dreams. He trusts that God is the one who is able um, to give the meaning of these dreams. So he tells them the meaning of their dreams. As he tells them, he tells the baker the bad news. Um, you're not going to live. In a few days, you're gonna be capital punishment by the Pharaoh. And to the cupbearer, he says, "You are going to be restored to your position when you let me get the exact verse here for you." Um, he says in verse 14, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness, mention me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this prison." Right? Joseph recognizes that he's there not because he's done anything wrong to Jacob, not because he's done anything wrong, perhaps foolish, perhaps arrogant, perhaps sinful, but not anything really unjust to his brothers. He hasn't done anything wrong to Potiphar. Like there's this huge injustice here. And he's asking the cupbearer, the person who has the Pharaoh's ears, who's going to be restored to this incredibly trusted position. He asks him, "Remember me," and ask that I be released from here. Because Pharaoh can obviously Potiphar can't keep him in jail. And Pharaoh can release him anyone that he wants. And so again, he tells the baker his dreams, and they both come true. And then in verse 23, such a very, very sad verse. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. At this point in the story, when we get to the end of chapter 40, everybody has forgotten Joseph. I mean, not forgotten him in the sense that they don't remember him. I'm sure Jacob remembers him. I'm sure his brothers remember him. I'm sure Potiphar remembers him. I'm sure they have a memory of him, but they're not thinking of him, right? Jacob thinks that Joseph is dead. His brothers think he's been sold off into slavery in Egypt. They're never going to see him again. Potiphar's thrown him in prison. He's moved on with the rest of his life, and his wife is as well. Cupbearer forgets him. Everybody forgets Joseph, except God. God is the only one who remembers Joseph in the midst of the prison. We don't know that yet. I'm giving spoilers for chapter 41, but you've already read the story. So God hasn't forgotten Joseph. It's easy for us to oftentimes think that, and to feel like we've been forgotten by everybody. And Joseph is a reminder that as God's people, God does not forget us, even when it sometimes feels that way. So any questions on Genesis chapter 40? All right. Well, when we get to Genesis chapter 41, Pharaoh has a dream, right? And he's troubled by it. He sends for all his magicians and wise men, but nobody can tell the dream. Nobody knows how to interpret this dream. And then the chief cupbearer remembers Joseph. Now, don't give the cupbearer too much credit here, right? This is when it's to the cupbearer's credit to remember Joseph, right? Like the cupbearer, if Joseph can interpret Pharaoh's dream, that's good for the cupbearer, right? So the cupbearer is kind of thinking of himself here, right? I mean, he remembers Joseph. He knows that this happened, and but it's really for in my mind, the way I read it, I think the cupbearer is looking out more for himself than anything else here. And so Pharaoh sends for Joseph. He's shaved, his clothes are changed because he can't come before Pharaoh, looking like a prisoner. And then Pharaoh says, I heard that you can interpret dreams. Verse 15 of chapter 41. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And you notice how Pharaoh is trying to put kind of the glory on Joseph here. And Joseph, to his credit, in verse 16, even after all this time, because it's been another 2 years after the cupbearer got out of prison that Joseph has been there. So it's been another 2 years. And in verse 16, he says, I cannot do it. Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Again, Joseph points the glory to God, even though he's been languishing for 2 years in prison, even though he is in prison because of something that he did not do, even though his brothers were the one who sold him into slavery. Like, think of all the things that have happened in Joseph's life, and yet still there is this faith that Joseph has that God is at work, that God is the one who can interpret dreams. So even in the midst of all of this, Joseph still has a deep faith in God. And then, of course, Pharaoh tells Joseph the dream. Joseph interprets the dream. And then Joseph says, hey, since all of this is going to happen, how about I give you an idea of how to work this out, right? He's favored by his father, probably because of Rachel. He's favored by Potiphar because he's able to handle the household, right? He's favored by the prison guard because he's able to handle the business of the prison. And now he's kind of taking all that experience and telling Pharaoh, hey, there's a way for you to go about, making it through all this. And Pharaoh recognizes the wisdom of Joseph and places him in charge of Egypt. Verse 41, we read, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. Now, the signet ring was a ring that would be used to seal documents. So back in the day, well, even today, I guess, you can forge signatures and that kind of stuff. They didn't really have signatures. So what they would do is if something was written by Pharaoh and it was approved by Pharaoh, they would fold it or roll it, depending on what they were using. And then they would drop some wax on it. And then they would imprint the wax with the king's signet ring. And that was an indicator that the Pharaoh was the one who was approving this. When he gives Joseph his signet ring, he's essentially saying to Joseph, you can make all my decisions for me, right? He's giving him an incredible amount of power here. So clearly the Pharaoh was both deeply troubled by these dreams, and I trust that God is at work in the midst of this, right? Kind of stirring his heart to be uncomfortable or deeply concerned about what these dreams meant. And then again, giving Joseph favor with Pharaoh so that Pharaoh pretty much hands over everything because not only does Joseph interpret the dream, but he gives a way of surviving through the famine. So in verse 42, then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger, put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. There are those robes again, right? So Joseph has been stripped of his multicolored robe from his father. He's been stripped of the cloak that he had as a servant. We don't read anything about cloak in prison, but now he once again is robed and he is privileged, right? He says in verse 43, he had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, make way. Thus Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of the whole land of Egypt. That's a pretty incredible turnaround, isn't it? And of course, in the back of our minds, we still have Genesis 37 there, right? Those dreams that Joseph had, the brothers are like, are you going to rule over us? And, Jacob's like, are you going to rule over your parents? And all of a sudden we see that God has worked over all these years. And there's probably, it varies, but most people say probably 10 or 15 years that Joseph is in this situation. Between from when he was sold to when he meets his brothers again. What I find interesting is that Joseph, and this is not part of scripture, so this is just me analyzing scripture. But what I find interesting is that Joseph has complete freedom to do whatever he wants to do at this point, but he does not go back to Canaan. He doesn't go back to his family. Doesn't go back to Jacob. Doesn't go back to his brothers. At this point, he has essentially kind of, I don't know. He's been so separated from them for so long that he doesn't even go back to them. It's kind of it's a sad thing in many ways. And I'm not sure what motivated him to not do that. Because again, as second in command of Egypt, he could go wherever he wanted, right? And we know they had the time to, because there were 7 years of plenty, and then the famine starts, and the famine has to take, I don't know, at least 6 months, 12 months, before Jacob's family runs out of food. So you've got a good 8 years that Joseph could be doing this. And I don't doubt that certainly he's building all these granaries and, collecting all this grain, and, all the abundance of Egypt is under his care. But surely all of us have been in high enough positions of leadership to know that no matter how busy the business is, you can take some time, right? And Egypt's not that far from Canaan, right? Maybe just a couple of days travel. So he has to be able to go to Canaan, but he doesn't. Now, I don't know what's behind that, but I find that very, very intriguing. That he has decided, maybe he thought his father had died already. Maybe he didn't want to, after what his brothers had done, he had no desire to see his brothers at this point. And maybe he's just so angry with it all that he knows that if he gets there, he might do something that he regrets. I don't know. Like, there's a lot of different possibilities there, but I find that really intriguing. That at the end of chapter 41, we don't see Joseph trying to go back to his family. Any questions on chapter 41? Very good. All right. So in chapter 42, Jacob's family runs out of food. Everybody knows Egypt is the place where there's food. And so his brothers show up in Egypt. And just as the dream was, there they are bowing before him. Now they don't know it's him. He knows it's them. Now there is a very good possibility. We don't know this for certain, but there is a very, very good possibility that Jacob's family are. You'll notice that when Joseph had to go before Pharaoh, he had to be shaved. So, and even when you look at ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics and the coffins and everything, you'll notice by and large they are shaved, right? They might have like kind of this long beard coming off the chin, but for the most part they are shaved around their face. And probably the Jacob's family are not, so they are, have typical Middle Eastern beards, and Joseph is shaved, and it's very possible that since his youth that his brothers have never seen him shaved, even, right? So and he's older, and so they don't recognize him. He's probably got the various kinds of makeup and whatnot, that the Egyptians would have used, because he's second in command to Pharaoh. I mean, he has access to all the goods that Egypt has. So his brothers didn't recognize him, but Joseph recognizes them, and understandably, he does not trust his brothers. Right? He's not sure what's going on here with them. Are they the same people that they were when they sold him off into, when they were eating a meal ready to kill him and then sell him off into slavery? Are they the same people? And so he goes through this whole thing where he says they're spies. He uh, you know accuses them of just trying to come and to see where the weaknesses are, so that they can attack Egypt. In verse 19, he says, or verse 18 says, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die." Now, the youngest brother is Benjamin, and Benjamin is Joseph's only blood brother, right? That's the only other son from Rachel. Rachel died in childbirth with Benjamin, and Benjamin's the youngest of the sons. And so Joseph is wondering, did his brothers not only want to kill him, but want to kill Benjamin? Because Jacob probably, Benjamin is the last of Rachel's children. Rachel's the favorite. And so maybe Jacob, started treating Benjamin the way that he treated Joseph, and the brothers got angry at Benjamin and killed him too, right? That he doesn't know what they're capable of. And so tells them they have to bring Benjamin back and leave one of them behind. And they, verse 21, they said to one another, they're probably talking in Hebrew, and they don't know that Joseph can understand them, right? And so they realize, they say they're being punished because of Joseph. And Reuben doesn't help the situation. He jumps in. He's like, "Didn't I tell you not to do this? But you wouldn't listen." So all that infighting is still going on. And they didn't realize Joseph's listening to them this whole time, right? And he hears them fighting. He hears them talking about kind of the guilt that they have felt over what they did to him. Verse 24, he turned away from them, began to weep, but then came back and spoke to them again. And he had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. And he put Simeon in jail, and now they have to take Benjamin back in order to get more grain. He gives them their provisions, and when they stop for the night, they realize all their money has been returned in their sacks. And in verse 28, their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling and said, "What is this that God has done to us?" They're afraid that Joseph is going to say that they stole it, right? So they don't know what to do. They don't return to Egypt, unfortunately, which would probably have been the wisest thing to do. But they go back to Canaan. Jacob says, that he will not send Benjamin. He's already lost Joseph. He's not going to lose Benjamin. And so they're stuck, right? They're stuck with this money given back to them for all this food that they've gotten. Simeon is still sitting in jail. And this is, Jacob, again, is not a great father. The dysfunction of this particular family we see here again. Jacob is willing to sacrifice Simeon to keep Benjamin. Right? He says, "I don't want to send Benjamin because I'm not losing Benjamin after losing Joseph." And so he's willing to sacrifice Simeon for the sake of Benjamin. Now, possibly part of the reason why he's willing to sacrifice Simeon is because of what Simeon did with Dinah. Remember, Simeon was with Levi, killing off all those people using circumcision as the military, weapon. Right? So I'm not so sure Jacob is very happy with Simeon. And so maybe he's like, well, this is Simeon's, punishment for what he did back then. I'm not sending Benjamin. But we do get to see that the brothers seem to feel some guilt, and that guilt is sincere enough to make Joseph emotional at seeing it. So, any questions on Genesis 42? Well, we get to Genesis chapter 43. Of course, we know from the dream that the famine's going to last 7 years. So Jacob's family is going to run out of food. And of course, eventually they do. And Jacob says, go back and buy more food. And Judah is stepping up here. And this is another reason why I think chapter 38 focused on Judah, because he becomes a bit of a Christ figure here as well. And he says, this ruler is not going to see us unless Benjamin is with us. So if you don't send us Benjamin, we can't get food, and there's no sense in going down. We might as well just die here. And Jacob is deeply troubled by all of this. Why did you bring this on me? And the brothers are like, this man questioned us closely. We didn't know what he was going to say to us. Of course, they don't know that Joseph knows who they all are, right? And so Judah says, fine, send Benjamin. But look at what Judah says in verse 8. Send the boy along with me, and we will go at once, so that we and you and our children may live and not die. I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life. And so we see Judah really stepping up, and this really significant change of heart in Judah over this time frame. So Judah does send him down. They meet with Joseph. They tell him, all the money was here. And Joseph says, it's all right. Verse 23, don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver. And then he brings him Simeon out to them. And so he kind of forgives, they're expecting to be punished because the silver was returned to them. And he says, no, of course, he's testing them in all of this. And so the steward takes him into Joseph's house. They have dinner together, and Joseph in verse 29 sees Benjamin. And in verse 30, deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. So again, seeing his brothers just brings back all the emotion that he has been going through over the last probably close to 20 years at this point. So after he washes his face, he says, serve them food. And of course, he doesn't eat with them because he's a ruler and they are not. And so he eats separately from them. But the men, in verse 33, the men had been seated before him in the order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest. And they looked at each other in astonishment. When portions were served to them from Joseph's table, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as anyone else's. So they feasted and drank freely with him. There are indicators throughout all of this that Joseph knows his family far better than they realize, right? He keeps talking about the God of your father has done this, right? He knows who God is, and yet they're not picking up on this. And probably because it's being done through an interpreter, and the interpreter is just using this, maybe a generic name for God. And so, although Joseph may be talking about, the Most High God, that's not coming through in terms of the interpreter. He knows their ages. They're astonished by this, that they just happen to get seated in the right order. And Benjamin gets this, 5 times as much. But what I think is really important in chapter 43 is that Judah has gone from the one who is selling his brother in chapter 37 to the one who is putting his life up as a ransom for his brother. And in this way, again, we kind of began the chapter saying that Joseph is a type of Christ. He foreshadows Christ. I think Judah also foreshadows Christ here, right? So he's putting his own life on the line in order to make sure that all of Jacob's children return to him. So, any questions on anything that we went through? Again, I know Zoom isn't the easiest to do this with, but does anybody have questions? You can use the raise hand feature by clicking on the reactions, and there's a raise hand button there. The reactions are at the very bottom. If you scroll down with your mouse to the bottom, you can click on reactions. And either there's another icon there that says chat or more. And under more, you'll see chat, and then that'll bring up a box where you can type in a message if you want. Any questions that anybody has on any of these readings? Okay, very good. Well, next week we are going to be back in person. If as you go through your notes, as you go through your reading, some questions come up, we can revisit that next week when we're in person, if that makes it easier for anyone. And I will have all the readings up on the website probably by the end of today. So that we finish off Genesis in our next set of readings. So now you will have finished off 2 books of scripture, and not small books either. I mean, they're 90 some odd chapters each. So I just want to encourage you to keep up with the reading. Again, if you've gotten behind, if you're able to get yourself caught up, great. If you haven't, and you need to kind of plug a few gaps, you can go on to the YouTube link that is in the Bible study page on our website and click on that, and that'll bring up a whole playlist of each week. And whatever week you missed reading, you can click on that and get a summary of that week if you haven't been at the meeting. And I want to encourage you to pick up the reading where we are if you're not up to date on it. So that we can keep going on this. I'm very encouraged by what each of you are accomplishing in this. So